For K-Pole and Contact Mission, I'm Andrew Kirschner. Today, I'll be discussing the ontological argument for the existence of God. The ontological argument was first discovered by St. Anselm in the 11th century. Originally presented as a prayer to God, the ontological argument is one of the most fascinating pieces of natural theology and philosophical logic ever conceived. I will be presenting it today in terms of a disjunctive argument. Everything goes into one of three categories: things that actually exist, things that might exist, and things that cannot exist. Examples of things that actually exist are cats, trees, baseballs, etc. Examples of things that might exist are cats, trees, baseballs, Superman, and flying horses. If you can think of something, if you can conceive of it in your mind, and there's an example of that thing, then that thing actually exists. If you can conceive of something in your mind, but there's not an example of that thing, then that thing might exist. Things that actually exist, therefore, can be conceived of, and we have examples we can point to in the real world. Things that might exist can be conceived of in the mind, but don't have examples that we can point to in the real world. Things that cannot exist cannot even be thought of or conceived because they're logically impossible. Examples of things that cannot exist would include square triangles or metal paper towels. No one can conceive of a square triangle. You can think of a square next to a triangle or a square inside of a triangle, but there is no way to think of a square triangle. A square is a four-sided, four-angled thing. A triangle is a three-sided, three-angled thing. You cannot have a four-sided but three-angled thing or a three-sided but four-angled thing. It's a logical contradiction. Similarly, you cannot conceive of metal paper towels. Either the towels are paper or they're metal. You cannot have metal that is simultaneously paper in nature. That would be a logical contradiction. Can you think of God? Can you conceive of God in your mind? Of course you can. It's not difficult to conceive of God. Believers conceive of God every time we pray to or meditate on God and His good work. But so too can atheists conceive of God. They do so every time they claim that God does not exist. Both believers and atheists conceive of the same God. Anyone can think of God. God is, by definition, the greatest conceivable being. Whatever the best possible being is, that's God. The greatest conceivable being must be all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good, eternal, necessary, and triune. If God were not all-knowing, then He would not be God, for there would be another potential being more knowing than Him. Similarly, God is necessary. To be necessary means that God can exist in every possible world, in every possible set of circumstances that could obtain. Necessity is an all-or-nothing concept. If God were not necessary, then He would be contingent. But a contingent being is not as great as a necessary being. A contingent being can only exist in some circumstances, but a greater being, one that can exist in every possible set of circumstances, can be conceived of. The greatest conceivable being, therefore, must be a necessary one. Necessary things either must exist or cannot exist, because there is no middle ground with things that are necessary. There's no possible way that something that's necessary only might exist. They either have to exist or they cannot exist. And if you cannot conceive of something, then that thing necessarily cannot exist. God is similarly all or nothing. God either exists for everyone everywhere, even if people do not believe in Him, or God does not exist anywhere for anyone, even if people do believe in Him. People's belief in or disbelief of God does not cause God to exist or not to exist. God is an all or nothing concept. Either He truly exists everywhere for everyone, or God does not exist anywhere for anyone. God, by definition, must have the great-making properties and must possess them to a maximal degree. Everyone inherently knows this. Believers worship God because He is the greatest conceivable being. Atheists claim such a perfect being does not truly exist, but both groups are thinking of the same thing when they think of God. Since God can be conceived, God cannot fail to exist. Things that cannot even be conceived are things that go in the cannot exist category. Things that cannot exist can't even be thought of because they're logically contradictory. But God can be conceived of, even by atheists. So God must either belong to the things that actually exist or the things that might exist category. But we've already established that God cannot belong to the things that cannot exist category because God can be conceived of. Neither can God belong to the things that might exist category because God is necessary. As necessary, God is all or nothing. God must either actually exist or God cannot exist. There's no middle ground when it comes to God. But God does not belong to the things that cannot exist category, since we can conceive of Him. With all this in mind, consider the following argument. A. Everything that exists either actually exists, might exist, or cannot exist. B. If you can conceive of it, it either actually exists or might exist. C. We can think of God, so God either actually exists or might exist. D. If something is necessary, it either actually exists or cannot exist. E. God is necessary, but was already eliminated from the cannot exist category, so God actually exists. Another way to look at it is like this. If it can be conceived, it either actually exists or might exist. But if it can be conceived, it does not belong to the cannot exist category. If it is necessary, it either actually exists or cannot exist. Necessary things are all or nothing. There's no middle ground. And lastly, God can be conceived and God is necessary. So that means God actually exists. God cannot belong to the cannot exist category because we can conceive of Him. And God cannot belong to the might exist category because God is necessary. God is the greatest conceivable being. God is certainly conceivable. God is all or nothing. Everything either actually exists, might exist, or cannot exist. And since God can be conceived, and since, therefore, God cannot be in the cannot exist category, and since God is necessary, God must either actually exist or cannot exist, but we've already eliminated God from the cannot exist category. This means the only option left is that God actually exists. God belongs to the actually exists category because God actually exists. This is St. Anselm's ontological argument for the existence of God. For K-Pole and Contact Mission, I'm Andrew Kirschner.